Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here, tradeathletics.com. Today we're going to be talking about addressing a late arm action. So I'm going to give you guys some useful insight and some practical drills and tips that you can take into if you're an athlete who's having trouble with your arm being late at landing, or if you're a coach who has athletes with this issue. We're just going to give you some things you can try and kind of go through some of the background and the causes of what contributes to a late arm action. So with that being said, let's get into the video. So an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to first go over what exactly is a late arm action. We're going to define that, talk about why is it a problem or when is it worth actually changing. Contributing causes, there's a bunch of different causes. It's obviously not always the same thing. And then how to fix it. So some general principles that we use in designing our backwards training progressions, specific drills you can try, an actual drill progression that you can go ahead and use with your athletes right away, and then some useful cues and tips for actually implementing those sample drill progressions. So that being said, let's go into exactly what is a late arm action. The timing of your arm action in this case refers to the degree of external rotation at landing. So when that front foot hits, where is that arm in terms of the degree of rotation? It's a little bit controversial in the pitching world whether front foot contact really means, hey, when the heel first touches, or maybe when the toe first touches, or does it actually mean when the front foot actually accepts weight and stabilizes? Now, for the sake of this argument, I'm going to talk about force acceptance. So not the very first frame that the front foot actually hits, but when that front foot actually stabilizes. And there's usually about a 1 frame on video difference between these two. So if the arm is maybe down when the heel just barely starts to tap the ground, but then 1 frame later the arm is up when the front foot actually accepts weight, I wouldn't personally consider that to be a late arm action by my definition, because again, there hasn't actually been an acceleration component yet. The arm actually isn't late relative to when the torso has begun to rotate. So again, I'm using force acceptance and the degree of ER at landing. On time, I'm defining as 45 to 90 degrees of external rotation, again at that instant of force acceptance by the front foot. So 45 degrees, again somewhere around here to here at landing. I would consider that on time. One study looked at compared Korean and American pitchers and found that the higher velocity group, the Americans, had about 45 degrees of external rotation at landing. The Korean group was actually the slower throwing group, but had 68 degrees of external rotation at landing. So they actually had a little bit more. Point being, 90 degrees isn't necessarily optimal and 45 degrees isn't necessarily optimal, but there's some general range that we can agree on would be considered on time as far as the arm at landing. So again, in this case, 45 was better than 68, but again, it's not that simple. There's always a lot more going on. So there's somewhere in that range. I'm not saying one is better than the other. Slightly late would be somewhere around 25 to 45 degrees. So if this is on time, 45 degrees, slightly late, you're looking at a guy who lands and their arm is still down here, somewhere in that range. And then late would be anywhere below about 25 degrees. So someone landing down here when that front foot fully stabilizes, I would classify them as late by my definition. Again, it's going to be hard to find a standardized definition of what is a late arm action. So again, this is my definition just for the sake of this video so we can kind of be on the same page. So why is it a problem? Well, it's not necessarily a problem in all cases, but I'm just going to kind of give you an argument as to why it might be worth addressing in some cases. The ideal scenario at landing, or when the front foot stabilizes. We're trying to have that energy flow up through the kinetic chain, pass ultimately into the pelvis, into the torso, and then seamlessly transition into the scapula, into the shoulder, out into the arm, into the ball. To ideally minimize the amount of stress that's traveling through the shoulder and make sure that it's in a good position, you want to make sure the scapula and the shoulder are in a position to actually accept that rotational torque and have a clean transition into layback. So if at landing the arm is down here, our scapula is still in anterior tilt, and the shoulder is at an IR, I'm not so sure that's a great position to transition into layback. If the shoulders begin to rotate, the arm's still down here, and now it's having to aggressively transition into layback at the very last second. I'm not so sure that's the best position to accept layback. So in an ideal scenario, the arm is relatively up, the scapula is in a position of posterior tilt, and now as we transition into actual layback and acceleration, the shoulder can cleanly transition into layback, the scapula is in a good position, and the shoulder is in a good position to stay centrated, golf ball on a tee scenario where the shoulder stays centered in the socket as you go into layback. The other piece of the ideal scenario is that we're trying to minimize energy leaks as well with the arm action and maximize the elastic properties of the shoulders. You might say, well, we don't want to be late. Why don't we just all get up super early and land like that? Well, typically what you see is there's such a thing as too early as well, where the arm gets up and there's a lag component where you end up losing that free energy from the arm spiral. You end up losing a lot of that elasticity from the shoulder when a pitcher's way too early with the arm action. Now, there are some hard-throwing big leaguers who get up early, but it's definitely not the norm. It's definitely more common to see that natural arm spiral where the arm just gets up on time and you're maximizing that stretch shortening cycle through the shoulder, through the elastic properties of the fascia, of the pec, and through the shoulder. So that's kind of our ideal scenario, and why that 45 to 90 degree number that I cited is typically what you're going to see in most hard throwing pitchers, especially ones who typically have more of a durable career. So efficiency and velocity concerns. Again, we talked about a late transition into layback. This can be a similar result as early torso rotation, which has been shown to have increased torques through the shoulder, through the elbow, and a potential loss in velo. And the reason that happens is that if the arm is late at landing, then by the time the forearm actually gets vertical, by that time the shoulders have already begun to rotate open. And so by the time the forearm is vertical, now the shoulders are open, you're effectively in the same position as if you just landed open, forearm vertical. So it really is a similar mechanism as early torso rotation to having a late arm, because it's the timing between the torso, when the torso begins to rotate and put that stress through the shoulder, and where is that shoulder when that happens. That's one reason, is efficiency and or velocity concerns. It also tends to cause a linear finish and limited layback. Not always, but it can. So when the arm is late, again, there's not going to be as much room to actually go into external rotation and accelerate the ball over a longer arc of motion. So what you'll often see is that pitchers end up not getting nearly the same amount of layback. They have a little bit of a pushing finish, and it also becomes kind of a linear finish as well, kind of a dart throwing motion in a lot of cases. The timing of scap retraction is altered. So again, when guys are late, they typically don't get nearly the same degree of scap retraction as when they're on time, and they begin to rotate on time. And that rotation really screws that scapula into retraction and posterior tilt around their rib cage. So we're not necessarily taking advantage of scap retraction and that degree of stretching through the chest in a good position as we could be. Now, there are potential injury concerns as well. Again, I'm not a therapist. I don't have any hard proof of any of these things, but this is a little bit of kind of speculation as to why you often see pitchers with major timing issues go down with continual injuries. Kind of correlation and speculation at this point. We obviously can't pin an injury on one variable. Some people like to say, this guy got Tommy John, therefore there must be something he was doing that was wrong. That's not always the case, in my opinion. Sometimes you can have great mechanics, you can take care of everything you possibly do in the weight room, soft tissue. I've seen some of the most dedicated guys who have great mechanics, and they still have had multiple surgeries. So you can't always pin it on one exact mechanical flaw per se. So I'm fully aware of that. However, my argument or speculation as to what the mechanism behind why late arm action might be causing more stress is there's a more aggressive transition to layback. The transition from internal rotation into external rotation, back into internal rotation. That process, that cycle, it happens more aggressively. It happens over a narrower window when you're late. Now you have to transition from internal rotation to external rotation, back to internal rotation over a much tighter window versus being relatively up at landing, being able to ease into layback and accelerate into internal rotation over a little bit of a longer arc of motion, a little bit a wider window to go through that acceleration and deceleration process. So that's one argument as to why we might be seeing kind of this correlation between a late arm action and possibly higher injury rates. Again, that's more anecdotal. The other argument is that this process possibly decentrates the shoulder. Any strength coaches watching, for example, we're very aware when cueing maybe a bench press form or push-up form not to let athletes just dump into humeral anterior glide, scapular anterior tilt. We're very aware that overly stresses bicep tendon, the anterior ligaments of the shoulder. I'm arguing that potentially might be the case as well with a late arm action. When a guy is down at landing and you begin to rotate the torso before the arm actually has a chance to get up, I'm arguing that there's a potential that's creating an anterior shear through the shoulder, and that we're getting kind of that same humeral anterior glide mechanism as well, where you might not necessarily be able to keep that shoulder as centered in the socket if you're accelerating from a late position versus accelerating where that arm and that scapula are already up in a good position. Again, something that could be happening. The other concern is impingement. If you begin to rotate into layback, but the scapula is in anterior tilt and your shoulder is forced into layback, then you're asking more out of the actual glenohumeral joint. You're asking more out of the shoulder joint itself versus asking both to work in unison to get that nice congruent layback. So if we're down here at landing, the scap is tilted forward and we're asking it to just dive into layback super quickly. Again, that to me is a possible explanation for why it might lead to more impingement type issues as well. So again, just something to think about. I'm sure we're going to be seeing a lot more studies coming out about this in the next decade. So hopefully we can kind of get to the bottom of whether or not it really can be pinned on this one issue. So when is it worth changing? It's not necessarily something that I think you always have to change. It's more of on a spectrum. It's not necessarily black and white. So I would say you probably want to consider it if this is a often injured pitcher, someone who's had repeat injuries or repeat surgeries. It's probably something you want to take a closer look at. If that athlete has major velocity or command issues to where they're maybe not going to get to the level they want, or maybe they're not going to get playing time, or they're kind of at a dead end where there's nothing to lose at that point. Definitely something you want to take a closer look at. You also want to have probably a slightly quicker trigger towards making some of these changes if you're dealing with a less advanced or even a youth athlete, right? If this is a high school or JV or youth pitcher who's throwing, not throwing very hard, doesn't necessarily have any huge, career prospects as a pitcher at this point, that might be a change you want to make relatively quickly, especially if it's a very egregious late arm action. Probably want to have a slightly slower trigger on a higher level and or historically healthy college or pro pitcher. If it's a guy who's shown the ability to stay healthy, shown the ability to have success, he's throwing 95 miles an hour and he's just a little late at landing, right? This might be like your Steven Strasburg example where, first overall pick, he's just carving hitters. Right, are you going to be the coach to try to change that guy? Maybe you have this theory that it's going to lead to possible injury concerns. Obviously, he got injured after the fact. It's very easy. Hindsight's 20/20. Very easy to blame it on his late arm action and say we should have addressed that sooner. But are you really going to be the one to change that when it's very possible that he would have had a 10 years of being healthy? Right? You look at a guy like Max Scherzer. He doesn't have perfect mechanics, but he's been able to stay healthy. Are you going to mess with that? So I think we need to have a little bit slower trigger on someone who's pitching at a higher level and been historically healthy, and know that just because there is a mechanical issue, it doesn't always have to be the main focus. If a guy has 20 different mechanical issues, you probably want to keep the focus towards one or two of kind of the core issues and keep that to the off-season process. So again, just my 2 cents on when it's actually worth changing. So contributing causes. There's a number of different contributing causes. There's a lot of overlap between these. The first one is injury compensation, or a protective mechanism. So an athlete has some sort of anterior shoulder issue or some sort of medial elbow issue, and similar to when they kind of have a pushing arm action or limited layback, the body will try to protect itself against valgus, against torque, and it's going to try to put these protective positions on and not allow you to get into these more delicate end range positions. So sometimes I've seen this happen before. I'll give an example later in the presentation, but the athlete's going to be late and it's going to be linked to kind of this very pushing arm action, limited layback, and late flip up or not a high degree of external rotation at landing because their arm's trying to protect itself. And then you work on improving the timing, getting the arm up, and now you expose this injury, and their shoulder injury, this elbow injury that they had in the past that their body was really protecting around. So I'm always careful when a guy has one of these issues, when opening it up too quickly, to kind of ease them in to the intensity from there when you make a major change, because a lot of times it is protective and you can just expose some old UCL sprain or impingement or labral issue that was already there, that they had learned to throw around inefficiently. And so we just need to be aware that sometimes it's an injury compensation when you see an arm timing issue. Rushing is another example where the upper half gets out in front of the lower half at landing. And so because the upper half is out in front of the lower half, the arm just doesn't have time to actually get up in position relative to where the lower half is. So it's a timing issue between the upper half and the lower half. A fix for that is just thinking about keeping that back ear over the back hip, or keeping the head over the pelvis, or staying stacked as you go into landing. Those are all just kind of different ways to avoid leaking or rushing out in front. You can blame the arm action itself in a lot of cases. Sometimes it's overly long. It's kind of the length or the time that it takes for that arm action to go through its path relative to what the lower half is doing. So if you have a very quick tempo lower half, but you're taking this long, drawn out, slow arm action, a lot of times that's going to create a mismatch between the two. And the arm just doesn't have time to get up because the lower half is moving so fast. So that can be an issue. The directionality of the arm action. So are you a guy who comes straight up, straight vertical? This can actually not only lead to, we can do a separate video on this, the inverted W as it's often called. We'll talk about if that's even a problem in a separate video, but when guys get a little bit too vertical with the direction of their arm action, a lot of times that is going to be linked to having a little bit of a timing issue. And now similar to that, if the direction is over rotational or kind of hooking the arm back behind the body, if they're one of these guys who gets way over rotational, well, what path does that typically cause as you begin to turn the torso? When you get way too rotational and you begin to turn, the arm typically doesn't want to get up either, because the torso doesn't encourage the arm to actually flip up in time. Typically, we're looking for some sort of arm spiral. This is what the vast majority of hard throwing pitchers do, is there's a spiraling component up into that flip up position. The arm, you can think about it as a staircase, you can think about it as a pendulum. In order to get that arm flipped up and on time, typically there's a little bit of a spiral, whether it's a longer swing or it's a shorter arm action. There's a spiraling component to actually encourage the arm to naturally flip up behind the body, versus again hooking it over rotating or yanking the elbow straight vertical. So the directionality of the arm swing can play a big role in whether the arm actually gets up on time or not. Excess tension in the arm spiral is another one. Excess tension, you might just assume it's always a an activation issue or it's always a mobility issue where it's a problem with their tissue or it's a problem with their mobility or their flexibility. But the truth is it can be either one, and often both. So mobility restriction, you might see that they have tightness through their pec, they have kind of a pec tension issue, and so they tense up. You might see that they have, we'll typically see, as far as activation, you might see like an upper trap activation issue where their trap isn't really an issue mobility-wise, but when they go to throw, they've learned to just hike into that upper trap, and it ruins that arm spiral, it ruins their ability to relax through the path. Again, so there's a lot of different things that you'll see, but I would say horizontal abduction, the pec, tends to be the most common mobility issue, and then upper trap, kicking in the upper trap too soon, tends to be the most common activation issue that we'll see that limits the ability to freely relax up the arm spiral into position. And then the timing of the handbrake, again, that's another one. So if you break the hands later, you're gonna have less time to actually get the arm up. Early torso rotation is another one. So we talked about how it's really not just about the arm in isolation, it's about the arm relative to where the torso is. So when the arm gets up, where's the torso? Ideally closed, ideally the front foot is firmly planted and accepting weight. But if you have early torso rotation, maybe you have a perfect arm path, maybe you're not injured, maybe you're not rushing, maybe the arm is the right length, but your torso is just pulling early. So the arm is going through its spiral, going through the spiral, going through the spiral, and before you have a chance to get up, you pull the torso. Now you're late at landing because you yanked into early torso rotation early. So in this case, a lot of times our goal and our patterning goal is to teach them to be patient with their arm action, be patient with their front side, and hold that close a little bit longer, resist rotation through their torso to actually give their arm a chance to get up before they accelerate. And this is where some of the drills I'm going to go through at the end of this video really come into play. Forcing scap retraction, I was a victim of this one because I was taught, or people that I followed taught that, hey, big league throwers, a lot of hard throwers, they get into scap retraction, right? We all agree on that. Scap retraction is good in a lot of ways, but it's not just getting into scap retraction, it's how you get into scap retraction. And so this is my problem with forcing scap retraction, is that big leaguers don't create scap retraction by yanking their elbows back behind their body. It's not a forced scap retraction, right? This is my issue with scap retraction drills, the way that at least the way that I've seen them performed at times by certain athletes that I've coached is, and it's the reason that we don't perform them this way, is that athletes will be taught to just yank the elbow back behind the body versus having any sort of pendulum, any sort of spiraling action to that arm action. And so when you do that, you end up landing in this late position. As you turn the torso, the arm gets up late because you force scap retraction versus encouraging a nice, free, and easy pendulum-like arm swing that naturally flips the arm up behind the body versus forcing scap retraction. So when I was 15, 16, 17, I couldn't figure out how anybody in any of these pictures that I saw, any of these big leaguers, I couldn't figure out how they got into these positions of separation, pelvis open, shoulders closed, arm up, because no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get in that position. I figured they must have amazing mobility. They're doing something, there's something wrong with me. I can't figure it out. And it ended up being really just forcing scap retraction. The idea that you have to yank the elbows back behind the body, yank the scaps behind the body to create scap retraction is ironically very misleading, because the scap retraction happens naturally. If you just try to capture the momentum of the handbrake, that arm is going to naturally pass back behind the body and the scapula is going to wrap around the rib cage. But the goal is to do that free and easy, not force that position. Back leg extension is another big one. Now, not in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily cause an arm action because the back leg is extending. It's because of kind of the chain reaction that happens from extending the back leg early. So I can kind of demonstrate this, but basically everything's going great, and at the last second you extend. What happens is it's very linked to being uphill at landing, because as you extend the back leg, the torso ends up dropping and you end up throwing uphill, but linked with that, it ends up leaving the elbow down and late. Early back leg extension can be a quick fix. Like if you fix the early back leg extension and get them to rotate downhill better, oftentimes that will clean up where the arm is at landing on its own. Uphill long toss, I don't think that's necessarily a cause, but it can reinforce the issue. If a guy's really uphill or really late with their arm and you're constantly reinforcing an uphill angle versus letting the arm get up and driving everything downhill, that can be a negative reinforcement loop for having a late arm action. So sometimes we'll kind of encourage getting away from uphill throwing, especially if they're a late guy or a very uphill guy, just because I don't think we're necessarily reinforcing the patterns that we're looking for with uphill long toss in those specific cases. Guys, if you're enjoying this content so far, go ahead, like the video, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to this channel if you aren't already. Our channel is all about helping pitchers develop, breaking down mechanics, giving you strength and conditioning routines, and helping you throw harder and healthier. So again, would love and appreciate if you guys subscribe to us if you are not already. With that being said, let's get back into the video. So let's go through some general tools and principles that we like to apply to fixing a late arm action. Then I'm going to give you guys some specifics. Now, the first is the use of heavy or light balls. Again, we could do a whole video on this, and we probably will in the future, but in general, we like heavier balls for improving patterning. If there's a major timing issue with where the torso is, the arm's ability to get up, we'd like to reinforce that at slower speeds and lower intensities with a little bit of a heavier implement. Now, this could be a heavy plyo care ball, this could be a heavy weighted baseball in catch play, this could be an Indian club for patterning type purposes. Now, the reason behind this is that there's a lot more feedback of where your arm and your scap and the timing of everything, where it all is in space. There's an added proprioceptive component when you have a slightly heavier implement. You can really feel, and it exaggerates where your arm is. You can exaggerate that feeling, that loop of energy. And by personal experience and from talking to athletes that we've worked with, if you take a 1 pound ball and you try to hug it and your arm's down here, you lag your arm's late, it does not feel good. It feels very inefficient, very forced. Versus if you feel like you can really capture that loop of energy, arms on time, smoothly accelerate it, it feels in sync, it feels fluid, and you get that immediate feedback from having a slightly heavier implement. Now, contrast that to something like a wiffle ball. You throw a wiffle ball, you can throw it from your hip, and you don't really feel anything. It's so light, there's so little feedback from the ball. We're huge fans of using slightly heavier implements for patterning. Now, the caveat to that is if you go too heavy, now you're becoming so far removed from the actual motor pattern that we're trying to improve that I don't think you get the same carryover. So I'm talking about a 1 pound or a 20 ounce tap ball. I'm talking about something somewhere in that range, 7 ounces to 1 pound. You start getting into a 4 pound ball or a wrist weight for specific throwing related holds. You start to get too heavy. Now the arm doesn't have the ability to relax in the layback. Now you start to incorporate kind of muscling up, tense, pushing type arm action. So I do think we need to be careful going too heavy, but a little heavier than a baseball tends to be very helpful when it comes to repatterning these things. Light balls serve a purpose. My opinion is that you want to think about incorporating light balls, again, for guys who have arm speed issues, but as far as where it comes in the process, it's more about speeding up the arm once the guardrails are in place. So once they generally have the arm around where you want it, they generally have, the mechanical guardrails, they have decent mechanics. Now you can use the light balls to help speed their arm up if that is an issue for them, but for purely patterning purposes, it's typically not going to be as beneficial as using slightly heavier implements. So we can kind of approach the problem two ways. We can start them at that end goal. We can start them at landing with the arm up. That would kind of be back to front patterning. So starting with the arm up and then working on doing throws there, seeing, how does that feel with the arm up? Get that to feel natural. Now let's see if they can get to that position. So if we can go back to front, we can also go front to back. So working on the actual arm spiral process. How do we get to that position where the arm is up and on time? Now, both these cases, we're looking at kind of abbreviated starting points for the first case. And we're going to look at things like focusing on the arm spiral, figure 8 drills, pendulum type arm swing drills in the second case. So we use a combination of both slow to fast. I've talked about this a little bit before on social media, but when you're initially learning a new pattern, learning a new skill, if you just rush through it at max intensity, it's very unlikely that you're going to naturally just adapt the perfect pattern. As much as we like to say, self-organization, your body's not going to self-organize from point A to point Z on its own. It might self-organize from point C to point D on its own once you've kind of built in some general timing and awareness and the athlete kind of knows what he's doing. But starting slow is a very helpful tip. Especially when you're working on something like arm timing. Allowing them to feel, what does it feel like when the arm is up and on time, shoulders are back, accelerating from there. You can add speed after the fact. You can do 5, 10, 15 reps, 1 or 2 sets, a little bit slower, and now ramp up speed, 30%, 40%, 50%. Now you add speed, now everything's synced up and on time. So slow to fast is an important principle. And I do want to touch on this just because it's probably going to be a thought or a comment that a lot of you guys have. Shortening the arm action. It's in vogue right now. I've talked about it before, so I'm going to keep it brief. But is shortening the arm action a valid solution for fixing an arm timing issue? A lot of pro coaches would say yes. I would say it definitely can work. There's no arguing that it can work at times, but it's often a very difficult change, especially the way that it's coached, where these athletes are so internally focused on exactly how short their arm is, exactly what that arm is doing in space. That's a 3 to 6 month long process for a lot of guys, if not longer, if it ever clicks for them, that this tends to be a little bit more of an aggressive, high risk change, at least for a high performing or a historically healthy pro guy, that we're typically going to try some different constraint drills first before we go to something like just shortening up their arm action. So again, it's a little bit of a high risk change. For every guy that you see on TV that it helped a bunch, there's going to be a handful of guys that it didn't work for, or that maybe were screwed up. Again, just my opinion, just from experience, but I would just take that with a grain of salt. And one of the most common, I would say, misconceptions or mistakes coaches or athletes make when trying to shorten up their arm action with good intentions is not respecting the spiral pattern, right? Shortening up your arm action and getting it on time doesn't mean just break the hands and go hand to ear like a catcher. You're going to find very few Hall of Famers, very few 100-mile-an-hour throwers that throw that way, because you're not capturing that nice spiral-like figure eight type energy from the arm action. So you look at a guy like Joe Kelly, Giolito, Fairbanks, you look at someone who's made a short arm action work for them, they still have this spiral pattern. They still have some action of a spiral to that throw, even though the only difference really is the angle of elbow flexion that they're holding. They're holding 90 degrees of elbow flexion instead of extending the elbow as they go through the spiral. But it really shouldn't be, in most cases, teaching them to go hand to the ear and throw like a catcher. So again, I'll stop there, but just something to consider if you are considering shortening your arm action for the sake of improving your arm timing. So some abbreviated arm drills that we'll use, or some drills that we will incorporate to use the abbreviated variations. The lasso drill, by definition, is an abbreviated drill. So again, the idea here is just feel your landing position. Let's get you in the position we're going for at landing and see if you can take that position and accelerate from there. So this is a very regressed drill, but it's one that we use with a lot of our guys because it's almost impossible to mess up, right? If you get the elbow up in the position you want, you can stack the torso, you can figure out where you want everything, and then you learn to accelerate from there. This is, again, very hard to mess up, and it's really helpful from a diagnostic standpoint too. Can you do it in this position, but not in this other drill? Well, it tells us a lot about if it's a mobility issue, if it's a patterning issue, what the actual cause is, if they can do it in the most regressed variation or not. You can modify some of your standard plyo drills, and instead of going through a normal handbrake, just start your arm up and on time. So you can do this with a 10 toes, a pivot pickoff, or a rocker drill or a rhythm rocker. Again, there's really no limit to what you can do and which drills you can apply this to, but typically we'll limit it to kind of these earlier drills in a throwing session or in a progression, and from there we try to incorporate the entire handbrake. Now you can do abbreviated arm action work with a number of different implements. Indian clubs work great as part of like kind of the warm-up process at lower intensities. Plyos obviously work for a lot of guys, but some guys really don't like throwing plyos for a number of reasons. They just don't have the feedback, they don't have a target, they end up cutting balls or throwing balls, they just don't have any feedback to when they're throwing. So for some guys we'll use weighted balls a few ounces above or below, typically above in this case, the weight of a baseball, and we'll do that in catch play and or long toss. So throwing a 9-ounce ball, throwing a 7-ounce ball, doing some of these drills in your catch play to a partner at a moderate to low intensity. So again, we can work on it from the opposite angle. We can work on the arm spiral and the flip up, the actual how do we get to that position at landing. So the figure eight or the pendulum starting trigger, these are two different ways of thinking about getting the arm up and on time. The figure eight trigger, again, we're just trying to track a figure eight in the initial arm swing that roughly corresponds to the arm slot we're trying to create. So whatever arm slot you're trying to create, roughly track a figure eight that draws through that release point and then come back through the rest of the drill. That is going to teach you to really capture that loop of energy on the downswing and encourage that arm to get up on time. The pendulum starting trigger would be something where you basically just start either with the hand up and pendulum it down, or it's more of just an internal cue for some guys. You can start where the hands normally are and just think about penduluming the arm down, capturing that momentum into the flip up. So different ways to think about it. Typically we'll use this in a rhythm rocker, so in a kind of a split stance position. And again, we'll do Indian clubs, plyo balls, and or weighted balls in catch play, depending on the guy. Slow to fast, important principle here as they're beginning to feel out that position for the first time. Stroh motion, Marcus Stroman has put up videos of him doing this, but again, just really emphasizing body control and awareness at slow speeds to have better proprioceptive control of your body as you build speed. So this is something that you can do even if you are more advanced, just as you begin to build into your patterns for the day. Just first set of 10, second set of 10 at slower speeds. Oh great, now build into your fuller speed stuff. So again, that's just something we found to be very helpful in terms of the teaching process. Challenging the full pattern each session is still important. So it's not just about spending 3 months just doing abbreviated arm action drills and expecting that to perfectly transfer to the mound. You need to consistently challenge the pattern, even if it's 90% arm action drills, 10% stretch or wind up or curl hop type work. There needs to be some sort of consistently challenging the pattern to help encourage the transfer and give you some shots at the basket to actually transition what you're working on in drill work to the actual mound, the actual game, flat ground, something that's more game-like, something that incorporates more of your entire body, more of the entire kinetic chain. So challenging the full pattern each session is extremely important versus just going down these rabbit holes of months on end where all you do is arm action drills. You need to consistently give yourself a chance to try to transfer it to your patterns. 3 examples, I'll just put these up on the screen so that you guys can see. Johnny, he's an athlete we've worked with for a while. In his case, the late arm action was caused by early back leg extension, and he had a history of previous shoulder injury that he had kind of learned to throw around. His body compensated for that. We got him up, we got him on time, and he started to aggravate some of this previous shoulder stuff that he had been protecting from the start. So again, that's just one case that we've seen. Tyler, one of our coaches, he's a guy who it's kind of a directionality issue, and so he was very rotational during his handbrake, during his arm swing, and so for him that was really the cause, and that's kind of the focus for him in terms of getting that arm up and on time in a better position, is fixing the directionality of that arm swing to some extent. And then using myself as an example as well. Again, when I was in high school, I was taught to force scap retraction. I thought that was how you threw hard, and so for me, just changing the directionality of my arm swing from immediately yanking back behind my body with my scap to relaxing into that arm swing. Again, that was how I learned how to flip up my arm, get it on time. So again, just different examples of how it's always a slightly different cause, and we just need to be aware to treat each guy as an individual and really evaluate, why is this happening? It's not always from the same reason, so we need to approach it slightly differently in terms of the mechanics, the throwing, the cues, and the drill work. Here's a sample progression you guys can try. We have an Indian club pre-throwing warm-up. This is something that you can do at 10, 20, 30% effort with a 1-pound Indian club once you're warm, but before you actually throw a ball. Again, lasso drill, figure 8 rhythm rocker, and figure 8 walks. I'll put these all up on the screen so you guys can kind of see and go through them. This works really well if you keep the intensity down and use it as more of a shoulder warm-up than trying to add intensity. So again, we can reinforce it with the Indian club, slightly overloaded implement to reinforce that pattern. Plyos and or catch play, if you're a guy who doesn't do plyos, then again, this is your drill work portion. This is where you're working on getting the arm up and on time. Same drills, lasso drill and figure 8 rhythm rocker, starting slow, working to fast. We've also added in our 10 toes drill, so it's somewhat of a modified pivot pickoff. Again, working slow, progressing to fast. But then again, we just talked about challenging that pattern. So from there, it becomes building in the entire kinetic chain, some blending work. And so for me, my favorite way to blend arm action or upper half type stuff to the actual lower half is step backs. But we found that some guys still can't make that jump immediately to a full step back with a leg lift. And so doing step back slide steps where you eliminate the leg lift portion and you just bring in the lower half. Now the step back portion really just helps feel that back leg load up, feel that weight shift, similar to kind of a rocker drill. But transitioning then from a step back slide step to a step back with a leg lift tends to be a very simple jump for a lot of guys at that point. And then transitioning from a step back with a leg lift to some sort of wind up, walking wind up, just a regular wind up throw tends to be a simple progression as well. So as you can see, it's kind of a blending process where we're going one little baby step at a time, challenging the pattern each day, and again, monitoring it by a coach, or if you're an athlete watching this, having some sort of way of telling, are you on the right track? So video can be helpful for that. But again, it's so helpful, in my opinion, to have a coach so that you're not there overanalyzing your own video constantly, every throw, every day. I've been down that rabbit hole. It's much better to just have a coach who can say, we're on the right track, great job, and you don't have to get all in your head watching 500 throws a day. Not that you should throw that many, but don't be so obsessed with watching your own video. Use it as a gauge of, hey, am I on the right track? But don't get too caught up in exactly what you look like. It becomes such an internal focus thing that I've just seen guys get down these rabbit holes doing that. A tip with the windup. I really like going hands over the head with the windup. This doesn't mean you have to throw out of windup in the game, or that you have to go hands over the head out of the windup in the game. But this is another way to cue that pendulum-like action. If you go hands over the head, you're still working on capturing that energy as the hands come down. And so I've seen guys have almost immediate jumps, 1, 2, 3 miles an hour I've even seen, from simply working on going hands over the head out of the windup. So I prefer this progression. If you ask me for like the best progression to work on an early arm action, this is what I've come up with. So I'd love to hear from you guys as well. If you've had any experience as coaches fixing a late arm action, what worked for those guys, I'd love to hear it. There are a couple helpful cues as well that you can experiment with. So as far as the arm path, we've talked about let the arm pendulum, just that visual of a pendulum and letting the momentum carry the arm up is very helpful. Capture the momentum of the downswing, same concept. Float the arm up the spiral, same concept. Again, we're working on being free and easy, working on relaxing the arm, and working on letting the actual direction of the handbrake guide the arm up and into position. And for any of the abbreviated drill variations, you still want to minimize tension through the arm in general for most of these guys. So maybe you're doing a lasso drill. Instead of being tense here and rotating on a tense arm, thinking about the arm on a cloud. The arm is just hanging out on a cloud, so as you turn, you're able to segment the scap from the torso, and you're able to cleanly transition into layback. So arm on a cloud, leave the arm behind is another good one, just to encourage relaxing the arm as you turn the torso. So some of the helpful cues that can work for having a late arm action. Guys, thanks for watching to the end of this video. We've actually put together a free PDF that outlines exactly this routine with sets, reps, and video links to each exercise. If you have any questions on anything, email us, contact@triathletics.com, and we'll see you in the next video.